All right, buckle up, everybody, because we're diving deep today into some fascinating stuff about President-elect Trump's foreign policy. And let me tell you, it looks like things could get interesting, to say the least.
Yeah, definitely interesting.
We've got some excerpts from a recent ABC News article and a transcript from an interview with Rep. Mike Waltz.
Oh, right. Trump's pick for national security advisor.
Exactly. And let's just say there are some surprises in store.
Some surprises for sure, like Greenland, anyone.
Greenland, that's right.
What's really interesting is that, a lot of folks were predicting a more isolationist stance from Trump.
Right.
But these sources actually point to something much more assertive.
Assertive, yeah.
Almost like a transactional approach to foreign policy.
No, okay, so what exactly does transactional even mean in this context?
Well, think of it this way. Instead of those broad alliances we've seen in the past, Trump's approach seems to be more about, we'll do this for you if you do that for us.
I see.
It's all about clear deals and specific outcomes that directly benefit America.
So less about global cooperation and more about what's in it for us. Got it.
Exactly.
And a prime example of this seems to be the hostage situation with Hamas.
Yeah.
Waltz was pretty clear negotiations are happening right now, and Trump is dead serious about getting those hostages back.
Absolutely. And he made a really powerful point about how long they've been held captive.
Yeah, how long has it been?
These hostages have actually been held longer than the Americans in Iran back in 1979.
Wow. Yeah, that's a long time.
That really puts the urgency of the situation into perspective.
It does, and Waltz didn't shy away from spelling out what could happen to Hamas if a deal isn't reached before Trump takes office.
Right, like all hell to pay were his exact words.
All hell to pay. Talk about sending a message.
No kidding.
It seems like they're taking a completely different approach to hostage diplomacy than we've seen before.
It's definitely a hardline stance. Yeah. And it makes you wonder, is this a sign of things to come? A taste of how Trump plans to deal with other international challenges?
Good question. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about Russia and Ukraine.
Good.
We see Trump's eagerness to meet with Putin, which has raised some eyebrows, to say the least.
Yeah.
But Rep. Waltz suggests this meeting is all about setting the stage for a negotiated end to the war in Ukraine.
Right. And what's fascinating here is that he highlighted a global shift in sentiment.
Okay.
There's less of that blank check support for Ukraine we saw initially, and a growing desire to find a negotiated solution to the conflict.
Okay, so why is this shift happening now?
Well, it's partly fatigue with a protracted war.
Makes sense.
But it also reflects growing concerns about the economic cost of continued support.
Interesting. So it's not just about wanting peace. There are also some practical considerations at play.
Right.
And it seems like even Zelensky, Ukraine's president, is signaling that he might be open to negotiations.
He is.
But Waltz emphasized that before any meaningful talks can happen, things need to stabilize on the battlefield.
That's a key point.
What do you think that means?
Well, it suggests a strategic approach.
Okay.
First, understand the situation on the ground, then look for opportunities, and ultimately aim for a resolution that aligns with American interests.
I see your point about battlefield stabilization, but isn't that giving Putin exactly what he wants? I mean, doesn't that just allow him to delay negotiations while he solidifies his gains?
That's certainly a valid concern and a potential criticism of this approach.
Right.
Some argue that it rewards aggression and incentivizes further territorial grabs. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out in practice.
Okay, now here's something that really caught my attention.
What's that?
Waltz brought up Ukraine's potential for increasing its military manpower.
Oh, right.
Apparently, their draft age is 26.
Wow.
Which is significantly higher than many other countries.
That's a crucial detail you picked up on. Lowering the draft age could really boost Ukraine's forces and address concerns about their ability to defend themselves.
Wait, but lowering the draft age, wouldn't that be incredibly unpopular in Ukraine? I mean, how does Waltz think that would play out politically?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
It would definitely be a tough sell domestically, and there's no guarantee it would even be successful.
Yeah.
It seems like the Trump administration might be pushing Ukraine to step up its game if it wants continued support.
Interesting.
This ties into the larger conversation about Western aid and the expectation that those receiving assistance demonstrate a commitment to self-reliance.
All right, so maybe it's less about forcing Ukraine to lower the draft age and more about sending a message, hey, we're helping you, but you need to show us you're willing to do what it takes to defend yourselves.
Exactly. It's about aligning expectations and ensuring that American aid is being used effectively. It's that transactional approach, again, making sure there's a clear benefit for both sides.
Okay, now get ready for the really bold stuff.
Okay.
We've got Trump talking about potentially acquiring Greenland and the Panama Canal.
Wow.
I mean, wow, this seems like something straight out of a movie. What are the chances he could actually pull this off?
It certainly raises eyebrows, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But if we dig a little deeper, there's a strategic logic at play here.
Oh, okay.
The Arctic, with melting ice caps and new shipping routes opening up,
Right.
is becoming a real geopolitical hotspot.
Uh-huh.
And the Panama Canal, of course, is essential for global trade, especially for the U.S.
Right. I can see how controlling those locations would give the U.S. a major strategic advantage.
Yeah.
But how would other countries, especially those in the region, react to such bold moves?
That's a key question.
Yeah.
And one that's likely causing a lot of anxiety in places like Denmark, which governs Greenland and Panama, which has sovereignty over the canal.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We'll definitely need to explore those potential reactions further.
And let's not forget about China.
Oh, right.
Waltz specifically mentioned concerns about their growing influence in the Panama Canal region, pointing to the involvement of Chinese state-owned enterprises and Huawei.
Yeah.
That adds a whole other layer to this.
Absolutely. It highlights the lens through which the Trump administration is viewing these strategic locations, not just in terms of their inherent value,
Right.
but also through the prism of competition with China.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about maintaining American dominance in key areas.
So instead of just thinking about what's in it for us, it's also about what can we do to prevent China from gaining an advantage.
Exactly.
It seems like this rivalry is going to play a major role in shaping Trump's foreign policy.
It's certainly a driving force.
Yeah.
And it raises a lot of questions. Will this competition lead to greater cooperation or increased tensions?
Right.
How will other countries navigate this dynamic?
Good questions.
These are all things to keep in mind as we delve deeper into this new foreign policy landscape.
All right, so we've got this potential shift towards a more assertive and transactional foreign policy,
Yeah.
a move away from those open-ended commitments,
Right.
and a laser focus on securing concrete American interests, all while keeping a wary eye on China. It's a lot to take in.
It definitely is. And the big question for you, dear listener, is how do you see these potential policy shifts playing out?
Oh, yeah, that is the question.
Will they usher in a new era of American dominance? Or will they sow the seeds of further conflict and instability? It's a complex and evolving landscape.
Right.
And forming your own informed opinion is crucial.
We've given you a lot to think about so far, but this is just the beginning.
Yeah, just the start.
Keep exploring these questions, stay informed, and draw your own conclusions, because in a world where foreign policy can shift on a dime,
Right.
your understanding is more important than ever.
And remember, we've only scratched the surface here.
Right.
There's so much more to explore. The potential impact on existing alliances, the reactions from countries around the world, and the long-term consequences of this new approach.
Exactly. So much to unpack. We'll be back in part 2 to delve even deeper into these potential ramifications and discuss what you can do to stay informed and engaged in this rapidly changing world. Stay tuned. Welcome back. We just left off talking about how Trump's foreign policy seems to be shifting towards a more America first approach and what that might mean for places like Greenland and the Panama Canal.
Right. Right.
But those aren't the only potential hotspots, right?
Definitely not.
Yeah, well,
We have to consider the ripple effects this could have on the whole global landscape, especially America's relationships with its allies.
right. Like, what happens to NATO if Trump is suddenly questioning the value of those longstanding commitments?
Exactly.
Those alliances have been around for decades.
You have to remember, NATO is built on the idea of collective defense,
Right.
where an attack on one is an attack on all.
Yeah.
But if the U.S. starts prioritizing its own interests above those of the alliance,
Yeah.
it could really erode that trust and cohesion between members.
So it's like sending a message to our allies, you're on your own.
Yeah, in a way.
That doesn't sound good for anyone involved.
It could create a lot of uncertainty and potentially weaken those alliances.
And then there's a question of how our adversaries like China and Russia might react to this more assertive American stance.
That's what I was just thinking. Won't this just embolden them?
Well,
I mean, if they see the U.S. pulling back from its commitments and focusing inward, won't they take that as an opportunity to push their own agendas even further?
it's a definite possibility. They might see it as a green light to increase competition and maybe even escalate conflicts in areas where they have strategic interests.
So we could be looking at a more unstable world overall, more conflicts, more tension. It doesn't sound like a very peaceful future.
Well, it's certainly a concern, but it's not necessarily a foregone conclusion. It's possible that the shift in power dynamics could also lead to a new equilibrium.
Okay.
A kind of a rebalancing of global power.
Right.
But that would probably involve a lot of tension and uncertainty in the short term as everyone tries to figure out the new rules of the game. And with someone like Trump, who seems pretty unpredictable and willing to break with tradition, figuring out those new rules might be pretty tough.
Absolutely. That unpredictability is a major factor here.
Yeah.
It can be a strategic asset in some ways.
How so?
Because it keeps our adversaries guessing, but it also makes it harder to build trust and create stable relationships.
Okay, so with all this talk about global power dynamics and shifting alliances, what does this all mean for the average person?
Right.
How might these foreign policy changes actually affect their day-to-day lives?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting, right?
Yeah.
Because these big abstract geopolitical shifts can have very real tangible effects on all of us.
Like what?
We could see changes in trade, immigration, even travel, depending on how these relationships evolve.
Oh, yeah, I hadn't even thought about those things. Like, if relationships with certain countries deteriorate, could that mean higher prices for imported goods?
Yeah.
Or more restrictions on travel visas? That would definitely hit close to home for a lot of people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And let's not forget about the potential economic consequences of these policy shifts. Increased military spending, trade wars, sanctions.
Right.
Those can all have a ripple effect on the global economy, impacting jobs, prices, and even access to certain goods and services.
It's kind of like a chain reaction, right? One change leads to another, and eventually it affects all of us in some way, even if we don't realize it at first.
That's a great way to put it. It's important to remember that foreign policy isn't just this abstract thing that happens in far-off capitals. It has real-world implications that can be felt in every corner of the globe, even in our own homes.
It seems like we're entering a period of massive change on the world stage.
Yeah, it does.
And with these potential shifts in U.S. foreign policy, it's going to be quite a ride.
It certainly is. But amidst all this uncertainty, remember, we're not powerless.
Right.
There are things we can do as individuals to stay informed and engaged, to make our voices heard, and to advocate for the kind of world we want to see.
Okay, so before we wrap up part 2, can you give our listeners a sneak peek at what we'll be covering in part 3?
Sure.
I'm really curious to hear more about what they can do to stay informed and make a difference.
Of course. In part 3, we'll dive deeper into some specific scenarios that might play out as a result of these policy shifts. We'll explore different possibilities, from increased global instability to the emergence of new power structures. And we'll discuss what you can do to navigate this complex and ever-changing world. So stay tuned, because it's going to be a fascinating discussion.
All right, welcome back for the final part of our deep dive into President-elect Trump's foreign policy. We've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
From hostage situations to shifting global power dynamics, it's a lot to wrap our heads around.
It really is. But in this last part, let's try to make sense of it all by looking at some potential scenarios that could play out as these policy shifts take shape.
Okay.
After all, understanding the possibilities can help us navigate the future right.
Exactly. So put on your prediction hats. What are some of the most likely outcomes of this America First approach, and what can they mean for the world?
Well, one possibility is that we see a more fragmented global order, with alliances weakening and regional powers vying for influence.
Okay.
Remember how we talked about potential strains on NATO?
I do, yeah.
That's a prime example of how things could start to unravel.
So kind of a every country for itself situation?
Yeah, kind of.
Doesn't sound very stable.
It could be a recipe for instability, that's for sure.
Right.
If countries are less constrained by international norms and agreements and more focused on pursuing their own interests, it could lead to more conflicts and less cooperation.
Okay, so that's one potential outcome, a world with more conflict and less cooperation. Not ideal. Any other scenarios we should consider?
Another possibility is a realignment of global power, where the U.S. forms new partnerships based on shared interests rather than those traditional alliances. Think about it. Instead of automatically siding with our longtime allies, we might see the U.S. teaming up with countries like India or Brazil.
Oh, interesting.
Depending on the specific issue at hand.
Interesting. So instead of NATO, we might see the U.S. forming new alliances based on specific goals or challenges. It's like picking teammates for a game depending on their strengths.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This could create new centers of power and reshape the geopolitical landscape in some pretty dramatic ways. It'd be a very different world than what we're used to.
Speaking of a different world, we can't talk about all this without mentioning China.
Right.
They're a major force on the global stage. How might they respond to these shifts in American foreign policy?
That's a key piece of the puzzle. China's response could really determine whether we head towards a more cooperative or confrontational future.
Okay.
They could see this as an opportunity to become more assertive, challenging U.S. dominance in certain areas.
Right.
Or they could choose a more cooperative path, seeking to manage the relationship with the U.S. and avoid escalating tensions.
So a lot hinges on how China decides to play its cards.
It does.
But it sounds like there's a real potential for both conflict and cooperation, depending on the choices that are made.
Absolutely. It's a complex situation with no easy answers. And it highlights the importance of informed decision-making and strategic thinking.
Yeah.
Both from policymakers and from engaged citizens like yourself.
Okay, so we've explored these different scenarios. A more fragmented world, a realignment of global power, and a big question mark around China's role.
Right.
It's clear that things are changing and the future is uncertain. But amidst all this uncertainty, what can our listeners do to stay informed and engaged? What concrete steps can they take?
Well, first and foremost, stay informed.
Okay.
Don't rely on just one news source or perspective.
Right.
Seek out diverse viewpoints, both domestic and international, to get a well-rounded understanding of what's happening. Read articles, listen to podcasts, follow experts on social media. The more informed you are, the better equipped you'll be to navigate this complex landscape.
Right. It's all about getting the full picture, not just one side of the story.
Exactly. And once you've got that information, engage in constructive dialogue.
Okay.
Talk to people who hold different viewpoints. Challenge your own assumptions, and be open to learning new perspectives. We don't all have to agree on everything.
Right.
But we can learn from each other and have productive conversations even when we disagree.
Because even if we don't agree, understanding those different perspectives can help us see the bigger picture and come up with more effective solutions.
Precisely. And finally, don't be afraid to make your voice heard.
Okay.
Contact your elected officials, participate in peaceful protests, and support organizations working to promote peace and understanding. Remember, you have a voice, and it matters.
Because at the end of the day, we all have a role to play in shaping the future we want to see.
We do.
It might sound cliche, but it's true.
It absolutely is.
Right.
The world is complex, and the challenges are immense.
Yeah.
But by staying informed, engaging with others, and taking action,
Right.
we can make a difference.
Well, folks, that brings our deep dive into Trump's foreign policy to a close. We've explored potential policy shifts, their possible global impacts, and even what you can do to stay engaged. It's a lot to process, but hopefully you're leaving this deep dive feeling a bit more informed and empowered to navigate this rapidly changing world.
Remember, this is just the beginning of the conversation.
Right.
Stay curious, stay engaged, and keep exploring these issues. The world needs informed and active citizens more than ever.
And that's a wrap for today. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better world.